What's up, guys? It is Dan from FightWave. Hopefully you guys are having a fantastic day. Today I'm joined by a regular on your FightWave schedule programming. Probably my fourth or fifth interview we've been doing with him, but he's honestly just such a blast to speak to every single time. And the last time we spoke to him, he was one of Australia's most promising talents outside the UFC. And today I'm excited to say I'm joined by the newest addition to the welterweight division out of Australia. Somebody who pulls no punches, and like Dana White said, slick as shit, as was his submission against Muhammad Ado on the Contender series. And I'm privileged to be joined by him ahead of his upcoming fight in 2 weeks' time against Kevin Jousset. I'm privileged to be joined by the captain, Mr. Jono Micallef. Jono, thank you so much for your time, brother. And as always, a privilege to speak with you. This is like our fourth or fifth interview. How are you doing ahead of this fight against Kevin and your UFC debut?
Yeah, doing fantastic, man. And as always, it's a privilege to talk to you, man. You're a legend. I always have a time for you. Yeah, dude, this is unlike any camp I've ever had in my life. You know, every time you get to a fight, you're adding things on. And this one, I mean, dude, there are so many boxes I'm gonna tick. And just outside of, you know, making my UFC debut, there's a lot of other things that I just can't wait to get in there, dude. I really, really can't wait.
Definitely, and a lot to unpack. Of course, the last time we spoke on the outskirts of the UFC with the short notice Contender series opportunity that you certainly made the most of against Muhammad Ado, netting one of the best performances on the Contender series last season. Talk to me a little bit, just before we get into the fight with Kevin, about that whole experience of the Contender series and just the overall, I guess, going to, you know, the States and getting the victory and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, well, just to touch on that, that was the first fight I didn't have in Melbourne. So flying over to the States was all new. There was so many new things that were happening there. And outside of all that was fighting on Contender Series where a win wasn't enough. You know, you had to go in there. You had to make a serious performance. You know, you want to make the man Dana stand up. And he's already seen it all, you know. So for me, it was like, all right, we've got to do something special. And lo and behold, you know, thankful to my team and all the stuff we've been working and we put a great performance out there. We got Dana up and out of his seat and he was really excited to have me on and got the contract because of it, man. So yeah, can't complain at all about that. And it was a fantastic experience.
Definitely. And then, of course, on top of that, the whole experience of going not only just stateside, but the first fight, like you said, outside of Melbourne. I've heard horror stories about the plane ride from Australia to America. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad was the plane ride, and would you recommend it for other Australians trying to fight stateside?
Well, that depends on if you're an Australian coming in with getting no sleep. Honestly, man, I was, you know, we just had our baby just before that fight, so I was getting little sleep, you know, destroying myself in training and all that. So, mate, I was able to get in there, get 15 hours of sleep uninterrupted, relax. It was actually fantastic. But for those who are looking to travel, you got a 15-hour flight, full leg space. It's tough, you know. It's hard, especially if you have the opportunity to fight in your own home country. Why wouldn't you take that? You know what I mean? So and that's, yeah, coming on to that, we'll talk about in a little bit, but I'm lucky enough to fight in Australia and I'm able to miss out on that flight this time round. But yeah, that definitely makes things tougher and it becomes more of a trip, I guess.
Definitely. And just the trip, and that paired, I guess, with when you look at the experience of fighting on the Contender series, it is a make or break kind of experience and fight for a lot of fighters. And unfortunately, we see a lot of fighters that sadly just don't make the cut for the UFC. But for you, I feel like throughout the theme of your career, one of the biggest things has been a lot of people kind of discounting your experience and ability to thrive in high pressure situations. And time again, you go in there and you prove them wrong. So I guess in comparison to fighting on like a Hex Fight series or other organization in Australia where you have a packed crowd, to going to this kind of quiet, you know, the boss man's right there in the form of Dana White environment like the Contender series, what were some of the biggest things that stood out to you in that moment fighting in the Apex compared to maybe an event in Australia with the sold out crowd?
The biggest things would probably have to be the backstage production and everything like that, and on top of that, meeting people that you've seen on TV your whole life. You know, I've looked at and seen all these referees and cutmen and never been there, but seeing people out there at the Apex and all that sort of stuff is like, man, I'm here, you know. And that was it was a bit of a pinch myself moment when I was there in the back warming up and I was like, fuck it, we're ready to fight. at the apex. I've seen so many fights. You know, Stipe Francis had fought here. It's a legendary fight. But outside of all that, you sort of got to zero in and be like, regardless of all this, all these lights, I'm here to fight. You know, I'm here to take another man out, and he is the obstacle. He's the thing that I need to fix, fix my focus on, and I think that's what helps me, because that's what I get to. You know, you got to take yourself to a point where it's, I guess, zen, where all this other stuff, although it's there and it can distract you, don't let it. The problem is in front of you, and you need to solve that, and that comes in the form of another man that you need to take out.
Definitely. And I think one big thing that stood out to me about this fight, and I've highlighted throughout every interview we've done, is your poise in the octagon. There's not a lot of young fighters, especially, I feel like out of Australia, when we see a young fighter coming out, we know kind of what they're made of, because you guys from the start to finish are facing cutthroat competition, and I feel like that molds you for these moments. And ultimately, one of the best submissions I think I've seen off the Contender Series, period. And just the way that you got to that position, to getting the triangle, it was incredible. And seeing Dana White's reaction to that kind of spoke volumes of just your potential in the space. So when you got the opportunity to, finally find out that you were a UFC fighter, what were the emotions of building up to this lifelong dream and finally realizing and assuming it in front of your very eyes? And kind of was there any kind of conversation with Dana after, he called out your name and said you're in?
Yeah, the emotions were a very, very mixed bag, especially afterwards. I spoke to Dominic Cruz. He was in the back. He cornered the fight after us, and he said, "Hey, man, it doesn't stop now that you're here. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger." And as much as excitement as I did have, for me, it was like, oh, yeah, now we're in for the big show, and sometimes the scariest thing is winning, and knowing what your next fight's going to be, and the fight after that, until you do get to the top contenders and ranked guys. But I think that's just what draws us to it. That's what makes it so exciting. We did have some small words to Dana afterwards, but it was nothing too crazy. He did ask about, didn't you just have a son? I said, yes, sir. Yes, I have. And he said, that's cool. He just gave me my props. And to get props from someone like that, it's such a, Dana White, president of the company, absolute legendary man. It meant a lot for me. It really does. But the emotions were crazy. They were the heights of excitement to the feeling of, oh yeah, here we go.
Definitely. And you talk about that brief interaction with Dominic Cruz and talking about the climb up from just the Contender Series. Now the real work starts here. And we spoke about that briefly off air, about some of the biggest differences between a camp inside the UFC and outside the UFC. And while for the most part, a lot of camps in the fight game are very grounded and more or less the same, you spoke a lot about adding new elements and layers to your fight game. And that being one of the bigger challenges that you've realized since joining the UFC is now, what can you do to make you stand out or be a cloth or cut above some of your competition and competitors? So when you talk about the biggest takeaways from a camp, maybe pre-UFC to post-UFC, what are some of the biggest differences, and what have you kind of been just trying to incorporate into your camps now to mix things up now that, like you said, the work starts here and it only gets harder and harder as the climb continues?
Yeah, well, for me personally, how we structure our camp is, once we've got an opponent, once we have a name, we're focusing on him in terms of what he does well, what he doesn't do well, what I do best that will work for him. Outside of that, when we're not in camp, I haven't had much time outside of camp, it's usually just trying to develop skill and create or get new skills and focus on those. But then once you've got a fight booked, it's sort of like I focus a little bit more on what I do best and bettering that again. So it's like once you do get in those positions, they've got nothing for it. So obviously we've got an opponent now, we've got a name, and now I'm just focusing on my A game. And then that way, just sharpening the tools and getting that blade as sharp as I can cut through anything. But outside of camp, we focus more on developing new skills. So that's sort of my rough mind about it. But this camp, opposed to other camps, has been really good because I've been able to take away a little bit from working and been able to 100% focus on the training, on the recovery, on doing all these sort of things so the mind's right, the body's right, and everything's just ready to go and geared for the fight. There's a lot less distractions now, and it's in the long run, I think, going to be a massive for me. It's going to be really big.
Definitely. And, the biggest thing that stood out to me was there's almost no changeover time between the Contender series to the announcement that you're fighting Kevin Jousset. Obviously, we spoke briefly after the fight about what's next, immediate turnarounds. And you spoke to me then and you said, I want to get on that Sydney card if I can. That would be a dream come true to debut in Australia. Talk to me a little bit just about how the name Kevin Jousset came about, because I know prior to this you had another opponent in mind and he's obviously no longer with the promotion. What were kind of some of the thought processes when the name Kevin Jousset came across your desk?
Yeah, well, before Kevin got thrown forward, there was a bit of a leaked news that come out that a few guys started sharing, and it was Evan Elders, and I think that he's previously fought at welterweight and also at lightweight. That name was put to us, but it was at lightweight, and dude, there's no way I'm making that. I would have to cut it off. So, we obviously said, yeah, we'll fight him at welterweight if that is the case. I think that their camp didn't want to do that. So there was about 2 or 3 weeks there where we were still hoping for Sydney, gunning for it, training as we normally would, but there just hadn't been a name. And then probably about 3 weeks to a month ago, we got offered Kevin, and that was immediately like, yeah, let's do this. And the cool thing about this fight is Kevin previously fought on the Hex Fight Series, and he had the title. So when he vacated the title to go fight for the UFC, that's when I then won the title next. So this is one of them fights that's sort of been on my radar, and it's been he's a name that's been thrown around our camp a few times. So there wasn't any surprise there, but it just goes to show the level of Australian MMA. A guy that's come onto the UFC, he's done quite well, and then now for my debut fighting against him. So it's cool, man.
Definitely. And of course, like you mentioned, getting down to 155 would be next to impossible, especially when you look at the frame that you have. Like you said, I think that's a death wish waiting to happen. So good on you for standing your ground first and foremost. But on top of that, you've got an incredible training partner and good friend in the form of Jake Matthews, who you've, of course, trained with in the Melbourne area for quite some time now. I guess, what was the conversation? Because he's been somebody in the welterweight division for as long as time and day, who I still don't think gets enough credit for what he's been able to accomplish coming out of Australia with, I feel like, not as much credit to his name. So what have kind of been the conversations between you and Jake since joining the UFC? Any tips that he's given you or anything of the sort?
The main thing that he's sort of said is that you don't need to do anything special. You've gotten to the dance now by doing this. Just be yourself, dude. And I think that Jake's one of the guys. He's been in the UFC for so long, for years and years. And like you said, he gets forgotten about. So I think people need to start putting a bit of respect on his name, because he's fought the who's who in the UFC. But having someone like that around me to help and, point me in the right direction is massive, and just fill you in on things that you're expecting in fight week, stuff that you can use and utilize that will help. And he's a great person to have around.
Absolutely. And then, of course, looking at Kevin as an opponent, I think when you talk about the theme of your career, it's always, is this guy going to be able to handle the experience level of his opponent? And you've shined out time and time again, defeating some incredibly experienced guys. Some names that come to mind, of course, being Matt Vale and Joseph Luciano. And on top of this, looking at Kevin Jousset as an opponent, what are some things that stand out to you about his game and just kind of the stylistic challenge that he brings into the octagon in 2 weeks' time when you face off against him?
Yeah, well, there's a lot there. He's a great fighter. He has a good judo background. He's been doing that for a really long time. But he also, since going to CKB, has quite a good kickboxing game. So he can mix it up. And he's also, similar to myself, a big welterweight. So there's a lot of things there. He's got a good gas tank. Obviously he comes out of a phenomenal gym. So it's a massive challenge for me. But I think it's a good opportunity for me to prove to everyone that, like, yeah, I am ready for this. You know what I mean? And how lucky am I that I get the opportunity to fight in front of all the UFC fans and prove to them that I do belong here, So I couldn't honestly have written a better story myself, man. I can't wait to get in there and prove everyone.
Definitely. And it feels like every time I talk to a fighter out of Australia, just a couple months after the UFC comes to Australia, and a lot of these fighters end up debuting in Australia, which is incredible to see. I think it's a massive testament to how far the country's come in this sport. So when you got the opportunity in front of you to fight in Australia, and like we spoke about a little earlier, no flight out of Australia, you're still fighting, flying domestically, fighting domestically. How exciting was that you're going to have a home crowd advantage against, honestly, kind of a home crowd advantage for him too, but like, you're going to have a home crowd advantage, and it's going to be a homecoming in the UFC for you in your UFC debut.
Yeah, I was just going to say he's also an Australian New Zealand fighter, so the crowd is just going to absolutely love this one. You know what I mean? They're going to go crazy for it, regardless of who wins. So how good's that for me? Yeah, look, man, it is super exciting, but sometimes people can let that get to them. You know what I mean? So for me, it's just about not letting it get to me, not letting the crowd and the energy take away from what I'm going to do. And as I said earlier, what I'm going to do is to fight another man in front of everyone. You know what I mean? So I just need to disconnect myself from the fact that my family and friends and everyone's flying down to watch me fight. To all right, this is my job, and my job is to hurt this man, to take him out, and to get two checks doing it. You know.
Absolutely. And then, of course, some of the things that I hate about fight fans nowadays is they're very quick to critique a card. And I feel like with the amount of friends of FightWave and people that are fighting on this card, some great debutants, of course, some names that come to mind being yourself and Quillen Salkild, it feels like this card has kind of been unrecognized amongst fight fans. So when you look at the amount of debutant talent and the amount of talent that we know is present on this card, guys that go in there and they create incredible fights, what would be your message to the critics, I guess, that are maybe skeptical about the star power and quality come UFC 312 fight day?
Yeah, I feel like you're definitely right. It's missing that star power. It's missing those big names. But I think in that, what it usually does when it gives guys like myself a chance is it provides them fights that like people go on out in their shield. You when you see fights like this with guys making their debuts and young kids, expect us to go out blood and will, blood and guts. We're coming for everything. So that is what you can expect. So you're not going to get the big names. You're not going to get these flashy, cool guys that you know so well. But in these names that you don't know, like myself, you're going to expect to see wars, expect to see fights. And that's what you guys want to see, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, on top of this, like you said, not necessarily fighting with a chip on your shoulder, but fighting with something to prove. And I think with this card, it's the perfect opportunity for you, Jono, and other guys that are fighting on the card, that people are not really giving a fair shake, I want to say. And especially we've spoken a little bit about mindset in this interview, and just what's kind of been the thought process throughout camp, throughout the event, and throughout all sorts of other things that are probably crossing your mind right now. But perhaps the biggest thing, which I still want to first and foremost congratulate you and your partner Jackie on, just the incredible achievement of bringing a life into this world. And I think that that's been, one of the biggest things that I've loved seeing is just the motivation that comes and radiates across your content and what you put out into the world with, being a dad now. So what has kind of been the biggest, I guess, takeaway from becoming a dad and being able to find another fire lit under you in the form of just, putting on for your son?
Yeah, well, it's sort of what you alluded to a little bit there. It's about I only have this one opportunity to make a better life for him. So like I'm doing everything I can in my power to do that. And there's so many things that you can do, but like I'm going beyond what you think you can even do. Because if I miss this shot, then there goes that, you know what I mean? That ship sailed. So I'm doing everything to make sure that I jump on that ship and I stay on it for as long as I can and make a better life for my son.
Absolutely. And I think that come UFC 312, it's going to be a phenomenal night of fights. And I know that that prelim and early prelim stack of cards is going to turn a lot of heads. Just those fights on the early prelims and prelims, incredible fights from bell to bell, start to finish. And I guess for you, I want to ask you, Jono, because first and foremost, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure and privilege to speak with you and just to see your evolution from a guy on the regional scene that I feel like not a lot of people were giving credit at the time, to continuously breaking down barriers, proving people wrong like you always do, and now having the opportunity in your UFC debut to once again do that. What are your goals for this year in 2025, and what is your message to the supporters at home?
Yeah, well, I just want to fight and win fights, number one. You know what I mean? That's the most important thing. But outside of that, man, I just want to put on great fights for people. Like, I know that the winning is obviously the main and most important thing on our minds. But outside of that, it's putting performances. So if I can put on performances for you guys, man, then I'm winning. You know what I mean? So outside of that, I want to be a good dad. I want to be a good husband. But most importantly, put on performances for the fans. And I just wanted to say, man, when I was still just a regional kid fighting the scene, you gave me a voice, and I really appreciate that, brother. Here we are about to make my debut, and it's a cool story to come back full circle and talk to you now again.
Definitely. And she got me choking up, bro. It's you know, it's just been surreal to see the evolution that you've had, and just to be able to kind of be a part, a small part, maybe even a percentage of your journey, being able to speak with you, pick your brain, get those insights, and just be able to see where your headspace is at on your pursuit for greatness. I gotta say, the feeling is mutual. It's been a privilege to cover you, and I know for years to come, it's going to continue to be a privilege. I can't wait to watch you fight at UFC 312 on February 9th against Kevin Jousset. And to the fans at home watching, like I said in all of my 3 or 4 previous interviews with Jono Micallef, if you don't know the name, you're about to recognize the name, and it's going to be, I think, a household name across Australia, across, you know, Malta, across Uruguay, across the whole damn globe. So be on the lookout for Mr. Jono Micallef. There is a captain in Australia for good measure, and his name's Jono Micallef. And to the fans at home watching, do be sure to check out Jono on social media. It's been me, Dan, from FightWave. Hopefully you guys have enjoyed this interview. Do be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and have a great day.